Dana Whitfield stood at the edge of a stock trailer in a gravel lot outside Cassville, Missouri, looking at 70 goats that looked less like livestock and more like something that had been left outside too long in weather no animal should have to survive. Their coats were dull and patchy, bald in ragged patches along the back and flanks. Several stood with their heads low, scratching compulsively against the trailer rails. One doe had rubbed a raw, weeping patch along her shoulder, trying to relieve an itch that never seemed to stop. The smell coming off the trailer was thick, animal, and unwell. "$20, the seller said. He was a heavy-set man named Roy Bilks, already halfway back to his truck in the particular hurry of a man who wanted this transaction finished before he had time to think too hard about it. "$20? Whole lot, all 70. I got a herd health situation I don't have time or money to deal with, and the sale barn won't take 6 stock. You want 'em, they're yours. You don't? I got a rendering truck coming Thursday." Dana was 46 that spring, 2 years into owning 300 acres she'd inherited from her grandfather Earl and still hadn't figured out what to do with. The land sat mostly wild, old pasture gone to brush, fence lines swallowed by blackberry and sumac, a back 40 nobody in the family had walked through in decades. She'd tried leasing part of it for row crops the first year and lost money. She'd tried nothing the second year and lost more, just in taxes and upkeep, on land that produced nothing at all. She looked at the goats a long moment and found herself thinking unexpectedly of her grandfather's hands. The specific, patient way he used to hold a sick calf still at the vet's visit. Never rushing, never letting his own worry show in front of the animal. Earl had walked these 300 acres with her every summer she'd visited as a girl, long before she'd moved away for a career and a marriage and 30 years of a life that had nothing to do with this county at all. Pointing out fence lines and creek bends and the particular slope of ground where water always pooled after rain. He'd wanted her to know this land the way he knew it. She let that knowledge go quiet in her for decades, and inheriting the acres 2 years ago had felt less like a gift than like a debt she didn't know how to pay. She looked at the $20 bill already folded in her hand, which she'd brought for gas money on the drive home. "I'll take them," she said. Roy was already climbing into his truck by the time she said it and didn't turn around. "Suit yourself," he called back, and that was the last thing he ever said to her. If you've ever bought something everyone told you was a mistake and found out later exactly how wrong they were, I'd genuinely love to hear about it in the comments, and tell me where you're watching from too. I read every one, and I like knowing how far these stories travel. Now let's get into it. Her brother Mark called that same evening, having heard about the purchase from a cousin who'd heard it from Roy Bilks himself, already turning the story into county gossip by supper time. 70 goats, Dana? Sick goats, for $20. Mark's voice carried the particular exhausted patience of a younger sibling who'd spent 2 years watching his sister sink money into land that hadn't paid her back yet. He'd stayed in the county his whole life, ran a modest cattle operation of his own 12 miles east, and never once understood why Dana had come back for land she barely remembered how to work. "You know what a vet bill looks like on 70 animals with a real problem. You could be looking at more than that land's worth to you this year already." I looked at them, Mark. "It's not something serious. It looks worse than it is." "You're not a vet." "No, but I called one, and she agrees with me." Dana had, in fact, spent the drive home on the phone with a large animal vet named Priscilla Ochoa, describing the goats in detail, and Priscilla's read had been plain and immediate. Dull coat, patchy hair loss, compulsive scratching, restlessness, textbook lice or mange, both miserable for the animal and highly treatable, common in overcrowded or stressed herds, worse in cold months, worse still when a seller's stopped feeding a herd properly because he's already decided to be rid of them. Nothing in what Dana described suggested anything that wouldn't respond to standard treatment within a matter of weeks. That's still real money and real work for animals you don't need. I don't need them for anything, Mark. That's not why I bought them. Dana looked out the darkening tree line beyond her porch, the edge of 300 acres she still honestly understood less than she wanted to admit to her brother. You remember Grandpa walking that land with me? Every summer, practically? He'd point at things and tell me their names like it mattered that I knew them. Grandpa was quiet a moment. I remember. I let all of that go, Mark. 30 years of not thinking about this place once, and then he leaves it to me instead of you, the one who actually stayed and ranched it right next door your whole life, and I've spent 2 years feeling like I inherited a test I don't know how to pass. Dana's voice caught slightly, and she let it. I bought 70 sick goats because they were the cheapest way I could think of to finally do something with that land, instead of just paying taxes on a thing I don't understand. Grandpa didn't leave it to you as a test, Dana. Felt like one anyway. I know it did. Doesn't mean I'm not going to keep telling you when I think you're making a bad bet, though. That part's not changing. Wouldn't want it to. Dr. Ochoa came out the following week and confirmed exactly what she'd suspected on the phone, a heavy lice infestation across the herd, consistent with prolonged stress and poor nutrition, nothing that indicated any deeper illness. This is fixable and fixable fast, Dr. Ochoa said, working through the herd with a careful, practiced hand, checking coat and skin animal by animal. Ivermectin Poron, repeated in 2 weeks per the standard protocol, better feed, less crowding. You'll see real improvement inside a month. Most of what you're looking at right now is what stress and poor management does to an animal's coat, not what disease does to its body. She glanced up at Dana. Whoever sold you these wasn't lying about them being sick. He just wasn't telling you it was the cheap, ordinary kind of sick, not the expensive kind. Why would he dump 70 animals over something this treatable? Some men don't want the work of treating 70 animals with lice, even when the fix is simple. Easier to take $20 and be rid of the whole problem in an afternoon. Dr. Ochoa finished her exam and straightened up. You got real value here, Dana. Just going to take some patience to see it. Dana walked the pen slowly after Dr. Ochoa left, looking at each animal in turn the way her grandfather used to do with his own cattle, not rushing past any of them. There was a small, dark-faced doe near the back corner who hadn't moved from her spot the whole visit, watching Dana with wary, exhausted eyes, one ear notched from some old injury. Dana found herself crouching down near her, slow, the way Earl had once shown her to approach a spooked animal, low, sideways, no direct eye contact until the animal offered it first. The doe didn't run. She watched Dana a long moment, then took one slow step closer. Dana named her Patch for the bald spot over one hip, and found herself over the following weeks checking on that particular goat first every single morning before she did anything else. Dana spent that first month doing exactly what Dr. Ochoa outlined. Treatment, better feed, more room to spread out across pasture that had gone unused for years. And by the time the second round of treatment was done, the goats had already started to look like different animals. Coats filling back in, less scratching, less restlessness. A doe that had barely moved the first week now pushing eagerly toward the feed trough with the rest of the herd. Patch was among the slowest to come around, wary of hands even once her coat had mostly healed, but by the third week she'd started following Dana at a small, careful distance whenever Dana walked the pasture, never quite close enough to touch, never quite far enough to lose sight of her either. Dana also started doing something she hadn't originally planned, turning the goats loose on the worst of the overgrown back acreage, the tangled blackberry and sumac and scrub brush nobody in her family had cleared in a generation, because goats, she'd read, would eat brush most cattle wouldn't touch, and because it seemed like the only practical use she had for 70 animals that weren't yet strong enough for anything more demanding. The goats went to work on that brush with an enthusiasm that surprised her. Within 3 weeks, a section of the back 40 that had been an impassable wall of blackberry canes since before her grandfather died was reduced to bare ground and gnawed stubble, opening up sight lines through that part of the property Dana hadn't had in the 2 years she'd owned it. Sight lines, she realized one afternoon standing at the newly cleared edge, that she'd genuinely never had at all, not even as a girl, since this particular stretch of the back 40 had already been grown up wild even in Earl's day. It was walking that newly cleared ground one Saturday morning, checking on the herd, Patch trailing a few careful steps behind her, that Dana first saw the stone. It was a low, moss-covered line of fieldstone, barely visible above the cleared dirt, running roughly 10 feet before disappearing back under brush the goats hadn't reached yet. Dana knelt down and brushed away a season's worth of leaf litter and found more stone beneath it. A corner, deliberately laid, the unmistakable foundation line of a structure. She called Mark that evening, genuinely excited for the first months about anything to do with the land. "There's something back there, Mark. A foundation. Old stone." "Probably an old shed. Grandpa kept junk everywhere back there." "It's bigger than a shed foundation. I paced it out. 20 feet by maybe 16. Mark was quiet a moment. "That's cabin-sized." "I know." "You want me to come out and look?" "Tomorrow if you can. I want to keep clearing around it first, see how much more there is before it gets dark." Mark drove out the next afternoon and stood at the edge of the newly exposed foundation a long while, hands in his pockets, saying nothing for long enough that Dana started to wonder if he was going to find some new reason to doubt the whole venture. "Grandpa never once mentioned this to me, and he talked to me about every square foot of this place his whole life, every fence line, every bad well, every place the creek used to flood before he redug the ditch. Never once mentioned an old cabin foundation back here. Maybe he didn't know it was still here to mention, or maybe he just never had a reason to come back this far anymore." Mark looked at the stone a while longer. "Maybe he was saving something for you to find on your own." He said it half like a joke, the way he softened most things he actually meant, and didn't look at her when he said it. "And maybe I owe you an apology for the goat comment. A little bit anyway. I'll say the rest of it once I know how big this apology actually needs to be." Over the following 2 weeks, as the goats kept working through the brush around it, the full outline emerged, a small, one-room homestead cabin foundation, and beside it, half-collapsed but still structurally intact beneath its covering of dirt and roots, a hand-dug root cellar. Its wooden door frame rotted, but the stone-lined pit itself still sound. Dana called her Aunt Wanda, Earl's younger sister, the only living relative old enough to remember anything from before the current house was built. "That's the old home place," Wanda said, her voice going soft and distant on the phone. "Before your grandpa built the house you grew up visiting. His own father built that cabin when they first claimed the land, back before the First War. I was born after they'd already moved into the newer house, but Daddy used to point that direction sometimes and say the old cabin was still back there somewhere, gone wild. I never went looking. Didn't occur to me it'd still be standing after all this time. There's a root cellar too, still mostly intact." Wanda was quiet a long moment. "Your grandpa would have liked that you're the one who found it, Dana. He always did think you had his own eye for the place, even after you'd been gone so long. Told me once he figured you'd come back to it eventually, in your own time." Dana sat with that a long moment after they hung up, the phone still warm in her hand, looking out at the dark shape of the tree line where the old foundation sat waiting. Dana found the tin box 3 days later, buried under decades of settled dirt at the back corner of the cellar, rusted through in places, but the seal at the lid still mostly intact. Inside, protected from the worst of the moisture, were her great-grandfather's original land patent papers, the formal federal document establishing the original boundary of the claim, dated 1911, along with a handwritten account, several pages in faded pencil, describing how he'd walked the property line himself with a neighboring claimant the same year, marking the boundary by 3 specific landmarks: a large flat stone at the northeast corner, a bend in the creek to the south, and a particular double-trunked oak along the western line. Beneath the papers, wrapped separately in a scrap of oiled cloth gone stiff with age, was something else. A small, hand-carved wooden figure of a goat, roughly done, clearly a child's toy or a father's gift to one, its edges worn smooth from handling. Dana turned it over in her hands a long while before she understood from a note tucked beneath it in her own grandfather's handwriting, decades more recent than the patent papers, that Earl himself had found this same tin box once as a boy and had put the little carved goat inside it himself before sealing it back up and returning it to the seller. A private joke or a private promise never explained to anyone, waiting 70 years for someone to find it a second time. Dana held the small wooden goat a long moment, thinking of Patch trailing careful steps behind her through the cleared brush, and did not try very hard to stop herself from crying. Dana brought the papers to a local land surveyor, a careful man named Grant Osei, who'd worked boundary disputes across 3 counties for over 20 years. "This is a real document and a useful one," Grant said, examining the patent papers and the handwritten account together. "Original patents like this establish the legal boundary as it was originally surveyed and granted. If your current fence line and your neighbors don't match what's described here, that's worth knowing, because it usually means somebody's boundary has drifted over the generations, sometimes through honest confusion, sometimes through a fence just getting rebuilt a little different each time it wore out, nobody meaning any harm by it." Grant walked the property with Dana over the following week, matching the handwritten landmarks against what remained on the ground. The flat stone at the northeast corner was still there, buried under leaf litter, exactly where the account described it. The creek bend matched. The double-trunked oak had fallen decades ago, but its rotted stump, still identifiable, sat roughly 40 yards west of where the current fence line actually ran. 40 yards across the length of that boundary is real acreage, Dana, Grant said, running the numbers. Best estimate based on the original patent versus your current fence, you're looking at somewhere around 11 acres of grazing land that's legally yours, that your neighbor's cattle have been using for a long while now. The neighbor was a man named Curtis Handley, whose own family had run cattle on the adjoining property for 3 generations, and whose father and grandfather had maintained the current fence line as far back as anyone could remember. Dana drove over with the survey findings, not entirely sure what kind of conversation she was about to have. Curtis read through the documents at his own kitchen table, quiet for a long while. "My daddy always said that fence had been in the same spot since before he was born," Dana said. "Never had a reason to think otherwise. Nobody in my family ever set out to graze anybody else's land, Dana. I want you to know that plain before we go any further with this." "I believe you, Curtis. I don't think anybody did this on purpose. I think a fence got rebuilt a little different one too many times over 100 years, same as your surveyor would probably tell you happens all over this county." Curtis sat with that a long moment, looking at the old patent papers, the flat stone marked on the map, the stump where the oak had stood. 11 acres is real grazing ground to me this time of year especially. Not going to pretend that doesn't matter." "I know it does. I'm not asking you to just hand it over overnight either. I'd rather we figure out something fair together than have lawyers figure it out for us." Curtis looked at her a long moment, something in his expression easing slightly. "Your grandpa was a fair man, Dana. Whole county knew it. I'll say this, you handling it the way you're handling it right now, instead of showing up with a lawyer's letter, that's about the most Earl Whitfield thing I've seen out of this family in a good while." It took the better part of that summer to work out. A new fence line surveyed and set to match the original 1911 patent, a grazing arrangement that gave Curtis 2 additional seasons of transitional access to the disputed acreage while he adjusted his own herd numbers, and a shared cost on the new fence itself split evenly between them, since neither one had caused the drift and neither one saw much sense in making the other pay for it alone. Curtis came by that October, after the new fence was finished, and stood at the freshly cleared foundation of the old cabin a while. "Your great-granddaddy built a solid little place here," he said. "Shame nobody kept it up." "Nobody remembered it was here to keep up." Dana looked at the stone outline, the goats grazing in the cleared pasture beyond it, Patch standing closer to her than any of the others, no longer wary, no longer keeping her careful distance. Took 70 sick goats and $20 to find it again. Curtis almost smiled at that. Cheapest survey crew this county's ever seen. Mark came out that same week, walked the fence line with Dana in the low autumn light, and stood a while at the edge of the pasture watching the herd graze. Coats full and glossy now, nothing left of the animals that had come off Roy Bilk's trailer that spring. I've been thinking about what I said that first night. Sick goats, $20, real money and real work for animals you didn't need. I wasn't wrong about the money or the work, just wrong about the rest of it. He was quiet a moment. 11 acres and a piece of Grandpa's own handwriting is a strange thing to owe to a trailer full of goats nobody else wanted. I don't guess I'll doubt your bad bets quite the same way again. Won't promise to stop entirely, but I'll listen a little longer before I do it. That's more than fair. Heard Roy Bilks tells anybody who listen at the feed store that he always knew there was something to that land, like he had the first idea what was back there. Mark almost smiled. Man sold 70 sick goats for $20 and a rendering truck deadline. Didn't know a thing, never will probably, unless somebody tells him, and I don't feel any particular need to be the one. Let him keep the story. Costs us nothing. Mark nodded once and didn't say anything further about it, and both of them understood that was the last either of them needed to say about Roy Bilks, then or ever again. Have you ever gone looking for something small and practical and found something that changed how you understood everything you already owned? I think anyone who's ever inherited land or a house or even just a box of somebody else's old belongings knows that particular feeling, that what you've been handed is never really finished revealing itself, no matter how long you think you've already known it. Dana kept the goat herd, healthy now and grown to over 90 head with that year's kids, and put them to work each season clearing another stretch of overgrown fence line or back acreage, treating the brush clearing less like an accident now and more like the actual deliberate use she'd been looking for the land all along. She rebuilt the old cabin's foundation into a simple stone-walled goat shelter, leaving the footprint exactly where her great-grandfather had first laid it, and kept the tin box, patent papers, the small carved wooden goat, and all on a shelf in her own front room rather than a museum or a county archive, because Wanda had asked her to keep it in the family, and Dana intended to. She placed the little carved goat on the windowsill above the kitchen sink, where she could see it every morning while she made coffee, and never did explain to Mark exactly why she'd started keeping it there, though he noticed it the next time he came by and didn't ask either. The 11 acres came back to the Whitfield side of the line that October, cleanly surveyed, cleanly fenced, no lawyers, no lasting bad blood between two families that would go on being neighbors for however many more generations came after them. Wanda came out that same October, walked to the old foundation on her own 2 feet with Dana's arm to steady her over the rough ground, and stood there a long while, looking at the stone outline of a cabin she'd never once seen with her own eyes, despite being born only a few hundred yards from it. Earl would have been glad somebody finally came looking, Wanda said. He always did say the land keeps its own accounts, whether or not anybody's paying attention. Just takes the right kind of patience to read them. Dana thought of Earl's own handwriting on that decades-old note, of the small wooden goat waiting 70 years in the dark for someone to find it a second time, and understood, finally, exactly what her grandfather had meant all those summers ago, walking these same acres with a granddaughter who hadn't yet learned to listen. This is farm lore, where we tell the kind of stories the land doesn't let go of easy. If a story like this one stayed with you, there's more of this county's history waiting. 70 goats nobody wanted, bought for the price of a tank of gas, cleared brush nobody had touched in 100 years, and found underneath it exactly how much of that land and that family had been hers all along.